Oh, good morning, afternoon, evening, whenever you're watching this. I'm going to go ahead and start a little bit of the lecture. Won't get much done, do a little bit, so we've got a little covered the first week. Other video, whatever the lecture, kind of the intro junk, so at least I don't have to do that. And I'm going to go over the first topic we'll start discussing this semester, and we'll pick up next week with regular lectures. That's much easier. I got to tell you, I'm getting really sick of these video lectures and online stuff. In fact, I was walking down the hall earlier, one of the other faculties here said, "Dave, you students are a bunch of dummies." And I had to agree with him, but don't get offended. See, I'm getting tired of just lecturing to myself, you see, so I didn't want to be alone, so there, I got my students here. There's one here, there's another. See, it's kind of creepy, but there, now I have someone to talk to. Yeah, that's what it's gotten to. So anyway, what we're going to start with today, the first topic we cover is the endocrine system. That's the first organ system we'll look at. And it's kind of nice because it jumps right in where you ended last semester. Last semester, at least in theory, you should have wrapped up with muscles and maybe the nervous system. The nervous system should be one of the major organ systems you covered last semester. Now, the reason that's handy is there are two major control systems in a human. One is the nervous system, which you've already looked at. You know, it helps you respond appropriately to stimuli. You know, someone pokes you with a needle, you tend to pull your hand away. Allows you to maintain homeostasis, you know, constant internal environment, regardless of what's happening, you know, out here. The endocrine system is a second system that works in a similar manner. The endocrine system is the second major control system. It allows you to respond to, you know, external stimuli appropriately and helps you maintain homeostasis. So those two systems they work together. Now, as you'll see, there seems to be a lot of overlap, but they're not redundant systems. They're used to control variables, but in completely different ways. So what we'll look at, you know, kind of the beginning here, we're going to look at just the general characteristics of the endocrine system, kind of how it works, sort of in general, you know, how it's controlled, what it does. After that, then we'll go through the specifics, kind of looking at individual parts and hormones and chemical signals. So the first couple lectures is just, I'm going to call it the general stuff, but it's actually probably the more important stuff. You always forget the specifics down the road. So, endocrine system. All right, what it is, it's a series of glands. So it's kind of a weird system. Students have a little trouble with this one. It's not like other organ systems that are, you know, you kind of see how they work, kind of connected together. The endocrine system's all spread out. And what it consists of is a bunch of things called endocrine glands. Now, you probably looked at these last semester a little bit. Particularly when you're looking at tissues, you looked at epithelial. One of the things epithelial will commonly produce will be glands. Now, you might recall, and again, I'll ask you a lot of questions about nervous system. I'll say, you remember when blah, blah, blah? You'll sit there, kind of don't remember that. It's okay. We forget that first semester. That's all right. It's usually rhetorical questions anyway. And you can't answer me now anyway because all of you are really quiet. But there are two types of glands. You've got endocrine and exocrine glands. If you remember, and both can be made from epithelial cells, an exocrine gland. This is the way I do a lot of my lectures. I use some PowerPoints. I'll integrate a little PowerPoint and narrate it at the end of this. But I like to scribble, you know, stick pictures of glands and other things on the board and talk about them real fast. So it's kind of the way to go. I do use some pictures when visuals necessary, like in development and such, but a lot of times just stick pictures. So if we look at an exocrine gland, one of the main categories of glands, this is the gland right here. And it's just a modified epithelial cells. But these cells produce some kind of secretion. I'll get it black. Some kind of material. You know, you can look at it last semester. An exocrine gland, examples could be sweat glands, salivary glands, sebaceous glands. They produce a secretion that is released out of a small tube, usually called a duct, and those secretions are released onto body surfaces, either internal or external. Like sweat, the ducts come up and they're on the surface of your body. Same with sebum, salivary glands. The ducts come out and they're internal surfaces, oral cavity, and so forth. So that's an exocrine gland. We've already done those, or you did a little bit last semester. We're not going to look at them. The endocrine system, as you might have guessed from the name, is made up of endocrine glands. Now, what's the difference between an exocrine and an endocrine gland? It's really simple. there are no ducts. Now, these glands, they are mostly still modified epithelial cells. They produce secretions, but these secretions aren't going to be released out of ducts. Where do they go? They're just released into the interstitial fluid. They're released inside the fluid of the body. They're not released on the surfaces. Now, these secretions have a special name. If the secretion comes from an endocrine gland, we're going to call it a hormone. Now, that's all the endocrine system is. A bunch of these glands spread out everywhere. Some are up in your brain, or remember, some are down in your abdominal cavity, testes, ovaries, gonads, which are technically in the abdominal cavity, but testes are a little further out. They all produce some chemical secretions that they release in the interstitial space. These secretions are called hormones. All a hormone is, it's a chemical signaling substance. You've already looked at a bunch of chemical signaling substances last semester. They're released from a cell and they change the characteristics of other cells. Neurotransmitters, you probably looked at last semester, that are released from one cell, presynaptic cell, into the interstitial fluid outside of that cell, and they affect, in this case, in the case of a neurotransmitter, a nearby cell, the postsynaptic cell, and they change its permeability or something like that. So a hormone is a chemical messaging substance, but there are a number of different internal chemical signaling substances. We need to have a specific definition for a hormone. So that's what I'll give you next. I'm going to run to a different diagram for that.
All right, so to kind of go over the glands and the hormones. All right, this is a bit of the PowerPoint, so I'll go ahead and post this up as well. So we're talking about the endocrine system. The endocrine system is chapter 17 in your textbook, and you've already got a Learn Smart Up that you should be working on. Basically, as it states here, it's a loose association of glands. So they're kind of spread out everywhere. And there's secretory products, which are hormones. So now we're not going to go over the details just yet. We'll swing through all these glands eventually. Some of you looked at pituitary, pineal, you looked at as part of the brain. They're also endocrine glands. So these are just kind of all the glands spread out in the body. What we need is to kind of define hormones. All right, so definition of hormone. I've got kind of three main points here, and this will kind of do it for you. Number one, they are secreted in small amounts into the interstitial space. Now, this is not unique to hormones, because again, if you think of neurotransmitters, are they secreted into interstitial space? Yes, the synaptic cleft is interstitial. That's not in a cell. That's extracellular. And small amounts. Goodness, yes, neurotransmitters, it's a very tiny amount released. But that's true of neurotransmitters, hormones as well. Now, it's number two here that this one's probably the key. Number two is what allow you to separate hormones from other types of signaling substances like neurotransmitters and paracrines or local hormones like prostaglandins and such. Hormones travel in the circulatory system. So they're released in the interstitial spaces. They'll make their way into the blood. And of course, once you're in the blood, where do you go? Everywhere. So they travel in the circulatory system. Again, often great distances. I mean, you could have a hormone released from the brain. It travels all the way to the abdominal cavity or possibly all the way down to your feet. And then number three is also true of many signaling substances, causes some sort of physiological change in another tissue. What's a physiological change? That's almost anything. A change in permeability, a change in protein synthesis, a change in gene expression, almost anything. So it causes some change in these distant cells. Now, one thing to keep in mind, the cells that are affected by a hormone, they are referred to as target cells. In fact, I'll use about three different terms here. It could be target cell, target organ, target tissue. That all means the same thing. As it turns out, hormones have a degree of what we'll call specificity. That is, hormones don't affect every cell the same way. So let me finish with this slide and talk about target organs.
Alrighty, target organs. So, let me go get my pens. I always carry them off and leave them laying everywhere. So hormones are produced in small amounts, released in the interstitial spaces. They move into the circulatory system, and that's how they're transported. That's the key. Most of the other signaling substances like neurotransmitters, paracrines, that sort of thing, they don't travel in the circulatory system. So that's kind of one way we can separate hormones from other signaling substances. And then they'll travel great distances and they cause some change in the physiology of these often distant cells. We call the cells that respond to a hormone called a target cell. I might also use the term target tissue, target organ. Kind of all means the same thing. Now, the reason this is important, if I took a hormone, I'll give you an example. One of the hormones we'll look at eventually is something called ADH. Yeah, we use abbreviations a lot because ADH is an abbreviation for a hormone called anti-diuretic hormone. No one wants to write anti-diuretic hormone, 8 times under paper. ADH will do, so there are accepted abbreviations. Feel free to use them. I will. That's anti-diuretic hormone. Now, these hormones are going to come from a particular gland. That is, not all the glands secrete all the hormones. This particular hormone comes from a gland we'll look at eventually. You might have looked at it last semester. It is a part of the brain. It's a pituitary gland that kind of hangs down from the hypothalamus of the brain. It is part of the brain. It's also an endocrine gland. So this pituitary gland will release ADH, which is a hormone. The ADH will be released in the interstitial fluid. It will make its way into the blood vessels. Once it's in the blood, where does it go? Everywhere. Every cell in the body, right? Transported by the blood. But here's what's cool. If I took some ADH and I took a little petri dish, I know it's good. That's supposed to be a petri dish, and I put in, let's say, a skeletal muscle cell. Just take a skeletal muscle cell, and I add ADH to the solution. You know what's going to happen? Absolutely nothing. The skeletal muscle cell will not respond at all to ADH. It's not a target organ. On the other hand, if I took another petri dish and I put in that looks like a flying saucer, that's going to be a kidney cell. If I put in one of the cells from the kidney, add the ADH, I see a very, very massive response, a change in physiology when I add the ADH. As we'll see later, it changes characteristics of some of the kidney cell membranes, makes them more permeable to water. So how do we explain this? Same chemical, ADH, same hormone. Add to this cell, nothing happens. Add to this cell, a marked effect. That's what we mean by specificity. Hormones don't affect every cell in the body, and they don't affect every cell in the body the same way. ADH, when you apply it to skeletal muscle, does nothing. That means skeletal muscle is not a target organ or a target tissue for ADH. It doesn't respond. On the other hand, some of the cells in the kidney, they are target organs. Why? Because they respond to the hormone. Now, my question is, why do one of these cells respond and the other one does not? What's the mechanism? We actually already know this, sort of. What would allow one of these cells to respond to a hormone, the other one not? It's just like neurotransmitters. If I put acetylcholine in a synaptic cleft, how does it affect the postsynaptic cell? What's on the postsynaptic cell that allows it to recognize acetylcholine? The answer is protein receptors. It's a similar mechanism here. If I have a target cell, let's just say this square thing is a target cell. Out here somewhere is the blood that contains a hormone, ADH. I'll just make a few little triangles represent the hormone ADH. Well, of course, if that ADH is in the blood, some of it will diffuse out here. Now, if this cell is a target cell, what you'll find is on the cell somewhere, in the cytoplasm, in the nucleus, on the membrane, somewhere that cell will have receptor proteins. Again, these are specific proteins with a specific three-dimensional shape that's basically complementary to the ADH. So when that ADH is released, diffuses out of the blood, it'll bind to these receptors, and it's the act of that hormone binding to that protein that causes the change. There's going to be some biochemical connection here. But when that hormone binds a receptor, again, proteins can change their shape, conformation, change their activity. That is the signal that causes a cell to do something, change its permeability, maybe open some ion channels or add aquaporins or something to change that cell. So, in order for a hormone to affect a cell, it has to have receptors. And that's how you have target cells. A target cell for hormone simply means it has protein receptors for that hormone. If the cell doesn't have the receptors, it's like the hormone isn't there. You'll get no response. So, as we go through all these hormones, one of the things you'll be asked in lab and in lectures, list a target organ or target tissue for this hormone. So, for example, in the case of ADH, we already know it comes from the pituitary. And it targets, what's a target organ? Well, you can say the kidneys or kidney cells, that's fine. There may be some others, but that's an example. And what's its effect? We'll look at that later, but of course, as I already mentioned, ADH changes the permeability. And as you can guess from the name, it causes you to produce a concentrated urine. All right, back to the PowerPoints.
All right, now, before I get much further, this is not a slide that's on the PowerPoint normally. This is a separate sheet. It'll be on Blackboard under the, Exam 1 or Endocrinology section. I call these things terms to know, or this one's called terms for MP2 endocrinology. All this is, it's just a quick outline of the basic concepts you need to know, the basic terms you need to be able to define, describe. They help, if you just kind of use them as guidelines. If they don't help you, chuck them. You don't need to use them. But this is like the minimum stuff you need to know. Memorizing definitions and basic concepts is good. You'll need a little deeper understanding to get some of the hideous questions I'll ask you on the exams and quizzes, but this is a start. So for example here, define, describe endocrine gland and exocrine gland. All right, just did that. Define a hormone. All right, we did define a hormone, again, released in small amounts in the interstitial space, travels into circulation, affects physiology. These other things, I'll get to in a minute. These are neurohormones, neurotransmitters. We've done neurotransmitters. You did them last semester. Neurohormones, something I'll talk about in a bit. But anyway, just go through these terms. What's a target cell, organ, or tissue? Excuse me. So this is just a basic sheet of terms. There's a couple of sets of it. So take a look at them. Again, they'll be posted to Blackboard as well. This is the other half of that sheet of terms. It was too big to get on one slide. It's on one sheet of paper in Blackboard. But again, it just tells you different things you need to define and describe. One thing you'll need to know for both lecture and lab, it's kind of a pain in the neck. And I'll get to this and give you plenty of examples as we go along. It says you should know the origin, effect, and target organ of the following hormones. Basically, when we're done with this, what you're going to be able to do is, if I tell you an endocrine gland, let's say, thyroid, for example, I'll ask you to list all the major hormones secreted by the thyroid gland. That's T3, T4, thyroxine, calcitonin. And then I might ask you to list a function for each of them. What do those hormones do? What's their action? And then give me an example of a target for these hormones. So you're going to need to know that for lecture and lab. You'll see these terms here on both your lab sheets and your lecture sheets. And I'll give you examples of these. I'll give you more later. I just thought I'd let you know that sheet is available, kind of the basic terms you need to know and understand. And we'll get to these one at a time as the lectures progress. All right, one more definition I should give you. So you got endocrine glands. You can define them. You know what a hormone is. You can define it. You might see another term, neuroendocrine glands and neurohormones. It's not a big deal. Some books don't even make a distinction. But most glands are made of modified epithelial tissue. Like your thyroid, like your adrenal cortex, like your ovaries, testes, that sort of thing. But some of these endocrine glands are actually made of modified nervous tissue, neurons. They've got a special name for those. They're still endocrine glands. They still secrete hormones. But if you see the term neurohormone or neuroendocrine gland, all that means, it's like a subcategory of endocrine gland. If the endocrine gland is made of neurons, made of nervous tissue, you may see it called a neuroendocrine gland. And the hormones it secretes, they are hormones, but you might see them specifically referred to as neurohormones. This includes many of the hormones that are released by neurons in the brain. Those hormones actually only target other brain cells. And there's a few others. So, for example, the posterior pituitary we'll be looking at, that is all made of neurons. It's nervous tissue. It's a neuroendocrine gland. The hypothalamus, which is a part of the brain, it's nervous tissue. It is also an endocrine gland. So it's a neuroendocrine gland, and it secretes neurohormones. There are a few others. The adrenal medulla is modified nervous tissue. So it's a neuroendocrine gland as well. So it's just a little slight distinction. I put some examples on here. Posterior pituitary, hypothalamus. I didn't list adrenal medulla, but they're made of neurons and nervous tissue, I should say, not just epithelial cells. So it's just a special class of endocrine gland. It's still an endocrine gland. It still secretes hormones. It's just got a slightly different name sometimes.
All right, probably the last thing we'll do here is make a quick comparison of the endocrine system and the nervous system. Part of the reason we do that, in theory anyway, you've already gotten over the nervous system. You kind of know how it works. Yeah, you've forgotten some of it, but you'll hear the terms, they'll ring a bell, hopefully. Kind of compare that, the system you kind of know, to the endocrine system, the one you don't. As I already mentioned, these are both major control systems. They allow you to respond appropriately to stimuli, maintain homeostasis, internal environment that stays constant regardless of what's happening outside. But again, they're not redundant. They actually may control even the same variable, but they do it differently. So if you kind of imagine, let's see, we'll do endocrine versus nervous system. Just kind of the basic way they function. How's it different? All right, speed. If somebody's asked you in general, how fast is a nervous system? Would you consider it a fairly fast response system or fairly slow? Well, how fast do action potentials move? They go up to 200 meters per second, something crazy like that. Nervous system is very quick. It's a very fast response system. I'll just put fast here. How about the endocrine system? Is it fast? Well, think about how it works. The hormone has to diffuse into the blood. Is diffusion real fast? Not for long distances, but maybe. Then when it gets into blood, it has to be transported by the circulatory system to the target cell, which could be feet away. The circulatory system isn't that fast. It takes a minute for the blood to run through the circulatory system. So just by the nature of the way it works, the endocrine system is going to be much slower. How slow is it? As we'll see, there's kind of a range. It doesn't take blood that long to move. So you have some hormones that can work, in a fairly short period of time, minutes. That's pretty quick for a hormone. Others, as we'll see, are incredibly slow. It might take them days and days to have a full effect. So the endocrine system is relatively slow compared to the nervous system. What else is different about them? Well, if you think of a motor neuron, say going to a skeletal muscle, how many cells does it affect? Typically not many. The nervous system has a very, very narrow focus, I guess you could say, a very localized effect. One particular motor neuron only affects a few cells. On the other hand, when you dump a hormone into blood, what's it going to affect? Well, again, it'll vary a lot. It might be from a few cells, but as we'll see, some of the hormones affect almost every cell in your body. One of the ones I use is thyroxine that comes from your thyroid gland. Every cell in the body basically has a receptor for thyroxine. So when it's released, it affects every cell. So, I don't know, we could call that wide or broad effect. Hormones tend to have they affect more cells, they have a broader or wider effect than neurons, which tends to be much more focused. Also, you might recall the nervous system, while it responds quickly, it typically doesn't sustain its changes very long. You might have looked at adaptation or habituation last semester. You go in a room, it smells really bad. But those olfactory receptors, initially they send all kinds of action potentials to the brain, and it smells bad. But fairly rapidly they stop responding. So the duration of the nervous system's effect is actually fairly short duration. It doesn't sustain changes for long periods of time. You smell something, but then the impulse goes away. Now that is one of the faster adapting portions of the nervous system, but it typically is of short duration. Your fight or flight response, which is from your sympathetic nervous system, it'll last 30 seconds. It's pretty short. On the other hand, endocrine system. Think of testosterone in puberty. How long are the effects of testosterone? Well, once testosterone is released, you don't really see those changes overnight. It can take days or weeks or months. The effect is much slower, but it's a long duration. You don't switch in and out of puberty. That would be traumatic. One day, it might seem like that. But the effect is it's slow, but it's sustained. Puberty stays as long as that hormone is still secreted. You can keep your male bits going. Long duration. Let's see, other differences between nervous system and endocrine system. Stimulus intensity. How do you control, sort of? Like, I guess what I'm saying is, if I touch your finger with a little feather, you can feel it, just a light touch. And then I, push on it with like a stick or something much harder. Can you tell the difference? Yes. Remember, all the neurons can send to your brain, your central nervous system, for interpretation or action potential. So how do you tell the difference between a light stimulus and a much stronger stimulus? If you could tap into that sensory neuron, all you would see is it's a different rate for generating action potentials. That is, it's a frequency it's a frequency control system. Faster the rate of action potentials, the greater the sensation. So slower action potentials, less of an impact. Faster action potentials or higher frequency, more of an impact. What about the endocrine system? You can't really pulse hormones into the blood like that because they're just going to get mixed up and are delayed by movements in the circulatory system. As you can guess, like many chemicals, many drugs, it's the dosage, it's the concentration. You can think of it as amplitude. With frequency, you can set action potentials at a fairly slow frequency, or you can send them at a much faster frequency. The amplitude of an action potential stays the same, right? -70, positive something back to -70. So the frequency changes. For drugs, including hormones, it's an amplitude response, or another way of looking at it, it's dosage. A certain amount of hormone will cause a certain effect. If you secrete more of the hormone from your baseline here, you'll get more of an effect. So it's dosage or amplitude dependent. So they're controlled a little differently. So the two systems are a bit different, but if you look at something like the example I'm going to show you just in a bit, it'll be the last one we'll do today. Body temperature. Your body temperature is 98.6 Fahrenheit, about 37 Celsius. That's one of those variables you have to maintain at a set point. If body temperature goes up, you screw up your hydrogen bonds and your proteins, enzymes don't work, you die. Body temperature gets low, same thing. Enzymes don't work, you die. So you need to maintain that at a set point. Well, both the nervous system and the endocrine system are used to maintain body temperature. Why both? That seems as what, is it a backup system? No. It turns out, while they're both used for temperature control, they're used for completely different reasons. Give you an example, I'll switch to a PowerPoint diagram.
All right. Now, what I want you to look at in this diagram, again, this is kind of my example of the nervous system and the endocrine system both controlling body temperature. Now, what you're seeing in this diagram, here's the origin here. On the x-axis, this is time in days, 10 days, 20 days, and so on. Up here on the y-axis, this BMR is basal metabolic rate. It's basically your metabolism, your energy use, just sitting quietly in a chair, not asleep, not doing anything. So it's kind of your baseline, energy use right here. Now, what they're showing you here on this diagram, they have taken a dose of hormone. It's a hormone called thyroxine. Thyroxine comes from your thyroid gland. This is a hormone I mentioned earlier. It targets every cell in your body. And do you remember those metabolic pathways from last semester? Glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, and so forth. That is your metabolism. Those are the metabolic pathways that break down glucose and other organic molecules, make ATP, you burn the ATP, and so forth. That is your metabolism. Thyroxine targets cells, and what it does, it causes those cells to produce the enzymes needed for those metabolic pathways. So the more thyroxine you have, the more of these metabolic pathways you have, the faster you can break down glucose, make ATP, break ATP, that sort of thing. So that is your metabolism. So what they've done here, right here, time zero, they've taken an injection of thyroxine right at this point here, and they shot it up into this individual. I believe it was a rat. All right, now what I want you to note is they did the injection there. Look what's happening with metabolism. It's going up, 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 because that's what thyroxine does. It ups your metabolism. And right at this point right here, that's where it peaks. But what I want you to notice is, when did it peak? right about here, down about here. What this tells you, it took 10 days for the full effects of thyroxine to register. That's pretty bloody slow. All right, now what this does, as you increase metabolism, of course, all those metabolic pathways, remember, 75% of what they produce is waste heat. This is what maintains your body temperature. You burn up a lot more ATP, you'll generate more heat. That's going to, all else being equal, your body temperature will rise. So let's say you're going out to Freeman Lake, it's January, and somebody pushes you into water. Now, water it's really cold, has a high heat capacity. It'll suck the heat right out of you, like, 2 minutes in 30-some degree temperature water, and you have hypothermia and you're going to die. So if someone pushes you into water, is this thyroxine going to be able to help you and up your body temperature? Well, sort of. You jump in, you get cold, you release thyroxine. 10 days later, you'll start, you'll get its peak effect. 10 days later, you're dead. 2 minutes later, you'll start to be on the downhill path. So this is not going to work worth a poop. This is not what thyroxine is for. What do you do when you get cold real quick? You can't wait 10 days to warm up. What happens when you get cold? What do? You shiver, that sort of thing. That's the nervous system. So the nervous system is good for what we could call acute cold stress. You plunge into water, heat's being sucked out of you like crazy. The nervous system will make you shiver. It'll quickly control blood vessel diameter and send blood deep to the core, not out to the surface where you'll just lose more heat. That's the nervous system. So it's good for acute cold stress. It will rapidly try and warm you up because it's an emergency. In a few minutes, you're going to be dead. This thing will not help. So what on earth is it for? 10 days, how's that going to do any good? Well, let's do another experiment. Let's say we take you, you're a volunteer, of course, and out in this field out here outside of school, it's let's say it's August, and we tie you to the tree. Just gently. You could get off in an emergency, but you've agreed to stay there tied to that tree. And we have a little screen for you, a little tent. Someone brings you food and water. You sit in a lounge chair, read a book. It's great. And I guess they'd have to pay you for it. And it's fine. It's August. You got blue jeans on, a shirt. It's pretty comfortable. Then we bring you food. Everything's fine. But it goes to August and then September and then October. What's happening? Average daily temperature is going down. Not real fast, but slowly. It goes from, 80 degrees, 90 degrees, down to 70, down to 60, down to 50, and like now it's at 40. What are you going to be doing out there? All right, this is a seasonal change. This is more like it's not acute cold stress, it's chronic cold stress. The changing of the seasons. For us, it's a little artificial. We go inside and turn on the heat. But think about, this is what happens with all the deer and the squirrels and the critters that are out in the woods right now. They're faced with a much colder environment. They're losing heat faster. That's going to tend to cause their body temperature drop, which would kill them. So how do they compensate? Slowly, as the season changes, this thyroxine level can increase, and that makes them generate more heat to compensate for the extra heat loss as it gets colder. So thyroxine is used for kind of slow, sort of long-term changes in metabolism or body temperature. They're related. Well, that's kind of one of the differences. Nervous system, really fast. Endocrine system, really, really relatively slow. 10 days is a long time. Some of the hormones are slower. So that's just an example of, how fast they work. So you got both systems controlling body temperature, but they do it differently. Nervous system for rapid changes in body temperature for sort of acute cold stress. Endocrine system, more gradual. And I will tell you, the endocrine system tends to be more precise. The nervous system is fast, but it actually keeps the variable about where it's supposed to be, but it jumps up and down a little bit. It's not that good. As we'll see in a number of organ systems, the endocrine system is the one that's used for precise long-term control of the variable. So even though there's overlap, the endocrine and nervous system are used for different things. I'll wrap it up there for a bit. We'll pick up more on the next video.